Well, I think the whole situation with a so-called diplomatic war between Britain and Sweden on one side and Ecuador on the other, I think the situation is pathetic because for the first time in many years, basically a leftist country, Ecuador, used against the Western powers the same rhetoric that they usually use against sovereign states. Basically, the Ecuadorian authorities declared that Britain and Sweden could not guarantee a fair trial for Mr. Assange. This is something new because for many years, the accusation of not having a fair trial was the main weapon of Great Britain when it refused to extradite certain people to countries like Russia or Egypt and other countries. So it's a very interesting comic situation when the Western powers were treated head-on by the authorities of a small Latin American country. We'll see what happens, but obviously it's an interesting situation when Western powers basically don't want to try their own medicine.
Dima, but do you think that this move could help Mr. Assange?
Well, yes, because basically Assange thrives on publicity. And again, the same weapon that Western powers used against small sovereign states is now used against them. First, Assange published the materials which basically showed that the Western policies in countries like Afghanistan or Iraq, or indeed Russia and Eastern Europe, that these policies were rather hypocritical. I don't think that the United States is angry at Assange only because he revealed something about their informants in the Middle Eastern countries. Basically, these informants have been dying for a long time and it never created too much of a scandal in the United States. I think the reason was that he exposed the hypocritical nature of their foreign policy. And now they want to punish him and suddenly they encounter the same weapon that they previously used against their opponents. And what is interesting is that public opinion in Western countries does not believe the guarantees which are provided by such figures as, for example, the American ambassador in Australia. For many years, in the 70s, in the 80s, Western public opinion refused to believe the Soviet officials, and they had good reasons to do so. Now, somehow, we are facing a situation when we see that Western public opinion now does not believe American officials. Worse, it doesn't believe Swedish officials. Carl Bildt, the Swedish foreign minister, when he said that Assange would be given a fair trial in Sweden, that the Swedish constitutional system is so perfect, blah, 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 if he had been indeed a moral authority, I don't think there would be so many people who now want to save Assange from extradition to Sweden. So this whole story just revealed a very interesting thing. The Western governments lost their public opinion. This is something new. Indeed, Western governments long ago lost the Russian public opinion. And I think it was a huge, huge loss that occurred during the 90s and that they refused to notice. Now we see that they also lost part of the Western public opinion, because otherwise there would not be so many people protesting Assange's extradition to Sweden and fearing his further extradition to the United States.
Well, I'm sure that you've been following the situation with the freedom of expression in the United States, and I suppose that you might have noticed that someone who used to be an outspoken journalist, an outspoken author, is now either removed to the sidelines of the mainstream press or has chosen to become more accurate, or rather more cautious in his expression. So, do you think that perhaps this is something in stock for a country, a state, which is deemed to be a single pole of power in the world?
Well, I think that the solution to this very complicated dilemma is that there is no solution to it. I don't think that freedom of the press is some kind of a nirvana that you reach and then you can relax for the next 100 years. Freedom is a quest, and freedom of the press is also a quest. Every country, every moment faces problems with freedom of the press. Even when we write something on the wall about our close friends, we have to think twice before we write something about them. In the same way, there are no countries with absolute freedom of the press. There is always a corridor. There is never an open field. So I don't think that, freedom of the press is more in danger in the United States than, say, in Iran. But I think that we should stop just calling certain states free by inertia. Just, because they were better states than the Soviet Union or Communist China in the post-war years. The situation has changed. People change every second, not even every day. So every country has to prove that it respects freedom of the press. Not only Russia, not only Iran, not only the usual scapegoats, but also the United States and also Sweden, sorry.
So do I get you right that you maintain that perhaps the case of Julian Assange is a major test of the American tolerance to an alternative vision of their own policies?
Certainly. I think that lots of people whom I read on the internet, whom you can actually read on the sites of American newspapers if you follow the reactions to some of the articles, I think lots of these people would agree with me and with many other people that Assange himself became a sort of test. And it's very unpleasant for the Western governments to try their own medicine. Usually they create their own smaller Assanges in Russia or in China or in other countries. Now they should try their own medicine and show us how they cope with similar situations.
Dima, do I get you right that you personally are not exactly sympathetic with Julian Assange?
Well, I think that he is an interesting character. And indeed, the border between, he was accused of being a political activist and not a journalist. Well, the border between political activists and journalists is very blurred, and it will be further blurred in the future because we are past the stage of reporters reporting and not carrying any message, any personal message in their reports. Internet has killed, the exclusive news. Now, as soon as the news is on the net, it becomes public. So we're going to see more and more outspoken characters. We're going to see more and more journalists preaching and advocating certain causes. And Assange, again, is a very interesting example. He didn't publish any special thoughts of his own. He published documents. But when he published documents, he was accused of being a political activist. So, I'm a journalist. I write. I rarely disclose any classified documents. So I'm not exactly feeling too much of solidarity with Mr. Assange. But I think that his case is interesting, and it's a very good test, not for journalists, but for people who are supposed to react to journalists' work.
Dima, thank you so much.